Welcome to the Salon at Tokyo College. Today I will be hosting with Professor Shimazu, who is a well-known global historian. I'm John Lee. I'm a sociologist, social theorist. And today we're very honored to have as our guest Professor Hayashi Kaori, who is a renowned expert on gender and media, among other things, but she also happens to be the executive vice president at University of Tokyo, in charge of international affairs and diversity. Thank you, Professor Hayashi.
Thank you for having me today. Thank you very much.
Like many of your colleagues, you've been so prolific, writing on so many different things. But I wanted to focus on your more recent work. You published about 7 years ago a book called Media Distrust, Media Pushing. And I found it very interesting because it's a wonderful overview of level of distrust in media in Germany, US, Japan, among others. But since we're in Japan, I was really curious to ask you about the Japanese situation, which is one of the things you mentioned. I mean, it's some time ago, of course, but there's a great deal of media distrust in Japan, it turns out.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned how there's also lack of reaction or action, almost indifference. Why is that?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I've been thinking about it for quite a long time, and I wrote the book after my sabbatical year in 2016, when President Trump was first elected, and it was a big shock for university community. And then I thought, what is going on here in Japan? And I think similar things are going on, especially when we take a look at, for example, the election in Kobe, in Hyogo, prefectural governor. And the main information source for ordinary citizens is not corporate media anymore. It's more to do, they always check news at the social media and maybe the internet, Yahoo, and so on. So the presence of the corporate media or mass media, conventional media like newspapers and TV, has been really diminishing in the past years. And that really affects how people vote and how people think about politics and how people even think about the concept of news. They don't read news, they just check news, what we say.
Yes.
You just take out your phone and say, then usually people have this push function, right. And then say, oh, this happens, and somebody says something, but that's it. So that type of news reading has been so prevalent these days, and that affects how the politics has been thought, also in Japan. Yes, so I feel it's very problematic, yes.
So there seems to be a sort of gap in between sort of the popular practice, which is increasingly sort of moving towards sort of headlines, isn't it, through social web, as rather than more traditional corporate media. And the corporate media itself, which is actually very slow to pick up on these things. And so, I mean, obviously, there's going to be some way when things are going to change, and I'm sure corporate media would probably try to kind of sort of change the platform a bit or something like this in order to adjust to the changing popular sort of habits, really. But that might take, I don't know, it might take some time, because it's a whole mindset which has to change rather than, just the form, right? And that's probably quite difficult to do, I would imagine.
Yes, the corporate media in Japanese corporate media is like any other establishment in Japan, is very slow in changing. And they had this really big success in the 60s, 70s, and they grew together with other Japanese establishment. And people are right, because they perceive Japanese corporate media as establishment. So they are the ones who manipulate information, or they are the ones who are, so to say, always deciding something behind the scenes with politicians and so on. So I think the mindset of the corporate media management have to change, but it's really slow, and it's so interesting because Japan has the image of technology and computer and so on. But I think Japan is one of the countries in the world who are very slow in introducing digitization in the corporate media package. So yes. But it's not only the media, but other establishments,
Yes.
including this university, is very slow to change, which brings Japanese society stability. So there's part of it is a good thing, I think. There are countries that change constantly. For example, when the head of the government changes, like maybe in the global south countries, we have sort of differentiate the part of the world in Europe that it has a quite constant and established media, and global south, which are very vulnerable to the government intervention. And U.S. and England, U.S. and British U.K., they have a two-party system, so the polarization is very eminent, very prolific in these countries. And Japan is always a kind of exception. It hasn't changed. It's quite slow. But on the other hand, our society is very stable in a way, and also in a way predictable, and it has its good side. But nevertheless, Japan is also in the world, and Japan has also the influence of globalization. So we have to live up with the globalization process. So these two, how do you say, the lines has to be adjusted. And
if I can pick up on that point, I think I completely agree with you that there's a conservative side to Japan. A good way, in that they preserve a lot of the older media and so on. But at the same time, it seems to me that the dependence on the smartphone, I think the recent survey showed on per capita average was something like 6.8 hours. It's among the highest in the world. And walking around Tokyo, you see people glued to their smartphone, and social media play a disproportionate role. I mean, I don't mean to pick on Prime Minister Ishiba, but he's found that international meetings just looking at his smartphone. And so I completely agree with you. But isn't it also the case that there is this massive tsunami, as Americans like to say, coming, and that tsunami furthermore is extremely underexplored? That in so much, there's a lot of ugliness in social media everywhere. But in Japan, in particular, it strikes me, maybe because I consume it more, that there's a lot of what Freud would call this ugliness showing, kind of racism, sexism, xenophobia, whatever.
The problem with Japanese media, online media, is that they are mostly, tuned into entertainment, and the people take them as entertainment media and not news. And the reason behind it is that corporate media monopolized news information by themselves. And yes, so you're right. Japanese online world or cyberspace is very contaminated by hate speech and slurs, like racial slurs and so on. But it hasn't been so problematized in a way. I think we don't talk about it maybe partly because that some corporate media think that it's something going on in the cyberspace, so they want to think about their space, and not about the cyberspace for a long time. Now it's been merging, but so people are ignorant about that, and some vulnerable sector of population have been suffering by this, by such a hate speech and so on. So yes, it is problematic, and I think we are now, the Japanese society is undergoing the tsunami, but many people are not, just don't really notice what has been taking place.
Do you think that, because I actually don't know whether Japan is exceptionally bad, because if you look at things in the UK and all that, it's quite bad. And it's almost like, what surprises me about the UK, for example, is that a lot of it had never come out really until this social media came up. And it was surprising to me that there was so much sort of almost like a latent, passive-aggressive sort of outbursts, coming through the social media, the kind of things that people always thought about, but wouldn't dare to say it, in person. And now, that you can do that. You can let your sort of frustration out, and like for me, I just kind of always thought that Japan had that thing. It's got quite a lot of this element where people simply did not show emotions, did not try not to anyway, and maybe it's just in some sense quite a natural kind of way of sort of feelings coming out, although not in a positive way, because they sort of egg each other on, so it gets worse than maybe what they had intended. But can I ask you about technology in Japan? Because like John, John knows Japan much more than I do, but I lived outside of Japan.
No, she's very modest.
I know. I lived for decades outside of Japan.
For decades?
Yeah.
Oh, how many years? 5 decades?
53 years. So.
Well, it's interesting because she looks 35, but...
No, but what's been really amazing for me coming to live in Japan as an adult for the first time, probably living, I have to get resident kind of address, all sorts of things, bureaucracy and all this, is how analog the sort of society is, right?
I think this is what...
exactly, right. And the range of kind of services is actually sort of catered to the lowest common denominator. So somebody like my mother, when she was around, she could just use the phone. She never used, computer. And it's sort of, so a lot of it is actually about telephones. In most countries, at least in Europe, you simply can't use telephones because they won't even give you the phone number to contact and to talk to a real person. And also in Japan, I realized that you're not a human being unless you have your own phone, mobile phone. And even then, the funny thing, the way they use the phone is actually just to call you to say, am I speaking to Shimazu Naoko-san? You say, yes, it is. And I say, thank you very much. I'm just confirming your identity about the form that you filled in. And so it's really fascinating that everything operates on actually quite a different logic, you see. And when you're not used to that, it really is quite difficult to understand. But then once you get it, you think, okay, this is how it is here. And maybe this is why, in Japan, things are actually quite different because the system is set in a different way. But I think I've been thinking a lot about this thing because it's a lot to do with my own readjustment as well, that most people in Japan have not actually lived for many years at all outside of Japan. So in some sense, it's almost very unrealistic to expect people to somehow just pick up what globalization is happening and we're all supposed to be doing like this. But nobody really has experienced that kind of system. So how how are the Japanese people supposed to change? You know, that's sort of like what you're steeped in, what you're used to, and you know how it works, right? And it has a logic, internal logic of its own, and it works. And so to say that, you know, Japan needs to change, yes, Japan needs to change, but well, how do you do it? Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Without sort of experience another system.
Yeah, that's a good point. I have an idea. Because Japan hasn't changed, and at the moment it's very slow to change. Is that because the people who have power are Japanese and mostly men, and there's very little diversity in there. If we have somebody different from the people who have conventionally have the power here in this society, things will change. That is my theory also as an executive vice president here at the University of Tokyo. It's always that people, in their own perfect world, I think the bureaucracy is perfect. I think I don't know. I used to live in Germany, and sometimes even if I fill in the form and they submit it and they forget something, and things get also, they have their own problems. In Japan, you have to prepare so many documents and everything, and you submit it, then almost all the time, for sure, they do something. So even if it's not sufficient, but some reaction will come. Maybe the reaction is not enough, but you can count on them in a way. And the service is also, in their own world, in a way, perfect.
Yes.
Yeah, so we can count on them all, like trains come on time, and everything starts on time and things like that. But it's if you have to know how you do it, right? And you have to be in the group and have to always do things that they do.
So I find this very interesting because, of course, you're a renowned scholar of gender. And, of course, there is a logic to gender equality and emancipation, and I think we're all positive about all these things. But I have to be somewhat skeptical because it's, of course, good for women, and it should be done. But I wonder if there's any spillover effect. I mean, because there is a hope that if women were to seize power, say, they would do it in a much better way than men did. I'm sure they will do it in a better way, but I'm not sure if they will do it in a much better way. And in the sense, historical examples, Angela Merkel in Germany would be one, Thatcher, and if Takaichi had won, would she be much better than whoever?
Yeah. Yes, Professor Lee, that's very an important point. I wouldn't say, for example, particular persons in terms of whether women should take part in the governance or so. But I think women as a group, if they come into a certain in the positions of power, then of course, how different men and women are, it's always there's always an argument. But there are certain perspectives that women experience from the experiences only women have. At the moment in Japan, many things are constructed according to the people who work 24 hours, and behind them are always housewives who take care of children and also elderly people and so on. And things are all structured from, it's not the personal things, but from masculine domestic perspectives, and I want to break that. And if you, it's not only women, but maybe from people with disability or people from different cultural backgrounds. if they can participate in how to govern the society and say, okay, we have to move from Japan to overseas every twice or every third year. So then maybe how we, for example, renew the driver's license can be different or something like that. So I think diversity in governance brings about more different perspectives, and maybe that would partly solve the problems you have when you arrived here, because you came from overseas and experienced totally different system. But if somebody like you come here and take part in the position where you can exercise your power to say, oh, this is something very inconvenient from the person who have lived for decades outside, then, okay, so, oh yeah, that's right, so we can do it differently, or we can do something something totally in a different framework, or something, or we don't need this type of bureaucracy at all, something like that. So that type of diversity is lacking, I think. So maybe the perspectives, maybe among men also, men who graduated from elite universities and then became bureaucrats and decide things that we have to do in the daily lives. That's not enough, I think. We need more perspectives here in the Japanese society, because Japan is experiencing globalization, and also we need more women to take part in the labor force in a more decision-making positions. So that's what I'm saying, and it's not only the prime minister or parliament members of the parliament, but also in every corner of society we need voice from different perspectives.
No, you're absolutely right, and I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'm also, I think, just pointing to some of the obvious limitations, because I don't think it's true for you, but many gender scholars are less interested, for example, in inequality, class or status, whatever you want to call it, educational. So I think that's my point.
Yeah,
that in some way, as you ascend to power, women become more like men in some way. So where I work, I'm not going to say there has been gender parity, but whether you look at my department, I think there are more women faculty members, certainly more women students.
Here?
At Berkeley.
Berkeley.
UC Berkeley.
You don't know much about the University of Tokyo.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
So I like them better, I think, than men. I think they're better in some way, but I'm not sure if that changes the character.
I'm sorry, I disagree with you totally, because I've recently had an experience of meeting really senior women in Europe who are directors of institutes, who are directors of this, and it was most kind of striking that almost every place I went to, which it was led by women, and their approach to leadership is just vastly different. It's about sharing experiences, and it's not about competing, because in some sense institutions actually are, you can see that we're all in competitive positions vis-a-vis each other, but it's about overcoming that and try to create a space and try to create sort of experiences which is going to benefit an institute just like yours, so that we can all be better. And I was really struck by this, because this is, I had never experienced this level of kind of implicit understanding that we all have to better, the society or community that we are actually part of. And particularly as leaders, that's really strikingly kind of relevant and important, because if these people don't do this, then it will be like, you sort of adjust to the environment that's created by like hundreds of years of male dominance. So in that sense, I think it's not about kind of sort of comparisons of people who are in positions now all over the world. It's actually it's going to be much more incremental change, but I think it can happen because it's already happening. And when I was in Sweden, I gave a paper at the Department of Political Science in Gothenburg University. And what was really striking there was that almost every single senior professor was a woman. And because they're women, you have more women students at the level of PhDs and stuff like that. And it just sort of, to me, it just created quite a different kind of environment. And maybe it's this kind of, Sweden is famously very kind of gender equality, and they've been very successful at doing this. So maybe that's like, one of the, maybe best examples. But I don't think it's about like, is it better than men or women? It's actually about all of us. And it's about sort of creating a society which, as you very rightly say, it just has to have a much wider representative voices. It's not like these people have to rule the world, but it's about being able to listen to voices, views which you are not used to listening to. And I think it's this sense of like, the fear that one feels about encountering the unknown. I think there's quite a lot of that going on in society, and I think that it's that we each of us have to overcome, because there's going to be, whether we like it or not, it's just going to be more and more flows of people going to so many different places, coming to Japan, going wherever, and we will just increasingly encounter people with very different ideas and traditions and so on. But,
yeah, I agree. Yes, completely with you. I think it's not a matter of whether women are better or men are better. I think it is necessary in this world to make our world better. It's not that who is more competent or not. It's that if we want to create a better world, then we need to include more voices. And I have this research results that if, for example, in the media world, if we have more women in the executives, then they have more, for example, news contents that include more women voices, and also not only women but also minority voices. And then people read these news, or it has more power to disseminate that type of information. And in the Japanese media, that lacks quite much. So they always report government actions or government announcements and so on. So, and that bores people too. It's something that.
No, let me defend myself. I'm not against diversity.
Yeah.
Of course, but there is the reality that there's a deeper inequality that gets reproduced, even when, say, university elites become. There's gender parity or even gender superiority. And one of the things that we find around the world today, I mean, for lack of better words, we call populism, is a reaction against this persistence of inequality and against elite technocrats like us who worry about these things, but in some way don't do anything about, some of the more robust structures of society. Obviously, inequality in particular. So that's, I think, my main point.
Yeah, yes, that's also a very important point, I think. But that's quite, I think, a different set of arguments that the elite and the polarization of society between those who have education and those who do not have education, that type of polarization is quite... especially in the U.S., I think it's the gap has been widening quite much, and I think people who identify themselves as liberals, I think they didn't see that widening gap between these. and then they try to, focus on their own lives.
Yeah, and I would even go so, I mean, sorry to stray from your research, but I would actually even go so far as to say that the real worry at some level in the US,
Yeah.
of course there is gender discrimination still, inequality, but it's actually the men who are doing terribly and going, and become the source of populist reaction. I mean, you go to university, it's almost all women dominated now. And
But that's after decades.
yeah, of
women
course, in
have
Japan,
been-
of course,
yeah,
it's not.
yeah, so
No, I
it's not-
completely agree.
Yeah.
Can I ask you another question, which is slightly different?
Yes, of course.
Because you talk a great deal about public, and of course in Japan, it's just my experience as a foreigner, that the public is not really valorized as much as it should be. You mentioned, of course, that in required education, compulsory education, now people have to take this course on Kokyo, public, but I don't know that you see it that much. I mean, in terms of the cityscape, there aren't that many public parks, for example. Even in terms of even the idea of the public sphere, it's just not something that calls people's heart. I mean, in German, for example, it's the Öffentlichkeit. And there's a kind of a whiff of emancipatory, wonderful thing about being part of the public. But in Japan, it's like Koshu Benjo or something. It's it's public, but
there's a film about it. It's
yes, wonderful, beautiful life. Yeah.
The toilet.
No, I know it's a wonderful thing about Japan, but I don't know. I don't know what you think, but
You mean the public
Yeah.
space?
just the idea of the public,
A type of normative
Normative idea of the
conception of
public.
public, right? Yes.
that's for everyone in some way.
That's been a big debate for years or for decades, whether there's a concept of public in Japan or not. And people say that public is something that has been created out of the Enlightenment movements in the 18th century in Europe, and that Japan hasn't experienced that type of Enlightenment movement, and we haven't had any, so to say, civic revolutions or something, or more kind of, for example, in Korea, they experienced the democratization movement in the late 80s, so they know what the power of public or power of citizens. But Japanese people didn't have that type of positive notion of publicness. Yes.
Let me put it in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel that private is extremely valorized in Japan to the point, for example, in work setting. I mean, it could be U.S., South Korea, it could be anywhere. I mean, people do talk about politics. People do talk about religion. But in Japan it's verboten. It's not possible. I mean, it's something deeply private, and therefore the public is vitiated. It's shrunk in some way.
Yeah, they don't talk politics because they are afraid of being ostracized. So it's maybe the different argument that whether it's public or not. But I think in Japanese society there is also some kind of publicness in community on the community level. At the community level, that they work together and try to amend or complement what community government can't do. They always, so to say, clean the streets and or help out, and reach out and help the kindergarten or do bazaar and so on. So space-wise, I think Japan is in a way very commercialized and very has in the 20th century the success of its capitalism has been so strong that many corporations are dominant in the urban space. So we missed that chance. But people's everyday lives are quite sustained by many type of activities that can be connected to the notion of publicness. But whether Japan is better than Europe or not, that I don't know about that. But I wouldn't totally dismiss the publicness in Japanese society. They do have their own type of publicness, public behaviors, and the cherishing or embracing the publicness.
Well, I think, I suppose it depends on how one kind of wants to conceptualize this publicness, right? Because one thing that I notice in Japan, which I'm sure everybody notices, which is that there is hardly any vandalism. I mean, if you go to Europe, there are a lot of so-called public spaces, but you wouldn't dare to go at night. You can't even walk around because it seems unsafe, and it's particularly so for women, And so, what is the public space that we can actually use? And in Japan, there are quite a lot of public spaces that we can use. And for example, we meaning women as well as children as well as men. And I see a lot of children playing outside to the extent which is simply not possible in London, for example, because parents have to chaperone children everywhere. So they sort of, they no longer play outside. Soto de asu kind of concept. You play in your garden if you have a garden, or you take them to the park with the parent. So the thing that you see in parks, you always have benches, so the parents can wait for the young kids to play in the playground. And if that's the sense of public that we are kind of looking for, I'm not sure, because I think it's great to have spaces where you don't actually feel as threatened as kind of individuals living in that society, and you can move around freely. I have never felt as unsafe, as safe as I have here in Japan, and I do feel that if I leave Japan, this is one thing I have to forfeit. Because like when I lived in London, I was always careful as a woman. So there is also that aspect of publicness, and what is it? We all should be owning the public space together, whoever you are. But I just don't think it's evenly owned, you see, from my experience. And so I don't think Japan has a very different kinds of notion. But people tend to do walks a lot. And where I live, there are quite a lot of parks, and people are always playing in parks with children. So
I think Professor Lee's view of publicness is also, there's this type of publicness that you debate about, for example, politics and public sphere, where very normative type out of the Enlightenment that you read newspapers and talk about how the government should be like when healthcare or the relationship with China and so on. That doesn't happen here. So in that sense, and the intellectual, educated people talking about government, that is, I think, the original notion of the public sphere by Habermas. And this is maybe not so prevalent here. But the publicness of what Professor Shimazu says is a unique point in this society, and I think, so I think the definition of public is quite diverse and I think also difficult if we are to talk about it from Asia at all. Yes.
I mean, certainly if you look back 100 years ago to early 1900s, there was actually a much more vibrant public sphere in the sense that Habermasian public sphere. And I was really quite struck when I was working on the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-05, how much there was. And essentially, even if the government didn't like, Henin Shimbun, the Commoner, was a very famous leftist newspaper at the time, they couldn't shut it because there was law, concerning these things. And so that's sort of like the image that one has of this so-called pre-war Japan. It's just not one and the same. It really is very different depending on when you're looking at. And so and when I was looking at stuff in the early post-war period, like in the 1950s, I was astonished how much the public sphere had shrunk because there are hardly any publications. You know, the richness of publications in the, you know, Meiji, late Meiji, Taisho period is astounding, you know, compared to 1955, for example. So there is, you know, maybe something has changed, and so I wouldn't say that there has been no public sphere, because I think there was.
I don't. I completely agree with you. By the way, don't demeaning. I'm actually talking about the present.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of thing that things that Professor Shimazu was talking about are actually achievements of post-war Japan. You know, that created in some way. Well, it's quite not a utopia, perhaps, but a highly viable, highly livable society in some way. However, I mean, I think many of the things that Professor Hayashi writes about point to the corrosion or decline of whatever that has been achieved. So, you know, there's a great deal, historically, by history, I just mean 20, 30 years ago, of public-mindedness. You know, there are these Chonaikai, Towns Association. There's a lot of neighbors looking out for each other, even cleaning their, you know, roads. But I think increasingly that has disappeared to the point where my neighbors, for example, where I live, they don't even put their nakuda on. And I said, why don't you put your address? And says, oh, I want to protect my privacy.
個人情報
You know, and they certainly don't sweep the front of my house. They don't actually even say hello.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, I forced them to say hello. But, So that's the... And I think that goes with this intrusion, if you will, invasion of social media and the smartphone.
I think there's an interesting research regarding Japanese as whether Japanese are individualists or groupists, and it's been debated. And I feel also sometimes that people, also in the working environment, people just don't greet each other. They say, if they see me, I'm sure that they know me, but they say, yeah.
But you're the executive vice president.
I mean, forget about...
I've thought very deeply.
So I wouldn't expect something like that as the executive vice president. It's not. It's really nice, but as a personal transaction, you can say hi, hello, and how are you. That is quite normal in Europe or in the United States. You say hi, how are you, and so how's your family, and so on.
In fact, they start saying hi more when they recognize that they have to be on the right side.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Very important.
Anyway.
I think, John, we're running out of time.
Anyway, thank you so much, Professor Hayashi, for taking
Was
time.
it good? I mean, I just...
It's been wonderful.
And thank you everyone for tuning in.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.